Well, it's time to rejoice. They say there is peace in the Middle East. The bombs have stopped falling, the hostages have been exchanged, and the politicians are shaking hands for the cameras. But tell me, how can there be peace without justice? How can we move on? How can we let bygones be bygones when one of the worst genocides of modern times was just live streamed before our eyes? Entire families erased, journalists executed, aid workers targeted, children starved. And now, as the world tries to move on, the perpetrators walk free while truth tellers are jailed. This is not peace. This is impunity disguised as diplomacy. And accountability, real accountability, must begin now in The Hague. President Donald Trump and the corporate media want you to believe that the Gaza ceasefire deal is the dawn of a new era. We're told to celebrate the images of the final 20 Israeli prisoners being released, always called hostages in the media, after 2 years of barbaric Hamas captivity, they say. But wait, even NBC admitted that Mnar Adley was kidnapped from his tank. Kidnapped from a tank. You can't call an armed soldier operating a killing machine a kidnapped victim. That's called being a captive of war. Still, Israeli crowds fill city squares to celebrate their release, while the same media that plastered their faces everywhere barely whispered that 2,000 Palestinian political prisoners and hostages are also being freed as part of the same deal. 20 Israelis dominated global headlines. 2,000 Palestinians are just a footnote. That's not journalism. That's manufactured consent for apartheid. More than 1,700 of those freed Palestinians were abducted from Gaza over the past 2 years by the IDF. Many never even charged without any crime. Yet there was no worldwide outcry, no senators demanding their release, no hashtags, no candlelight vigils. Over 10,000 Palestinians still rot in Israeli prisons today, including community leaders, students, elected officials, 400 children, nearly half of those people without trial or conviction. And Israel still refuses to return hundreds of bodies of those it has killed. Why keep their remains? What are they trying to hide? What have they done to them? Such is life under a genocidal apartheid regime. And when the Israeli captives returned home, they appeared well-fed and in good spirits. But Palestinian prisoners, many came back emaciated, gaunt, trembling, visibly broken like survivors of a concentration camp. And even their families' joy was criminalized. When Palestinians gathered outside of the Ofer prison near Ramallah to welcome their loved ones, the Israeli military dropped warning leaflets, threatening them, ordering the crowd to disperse, then fired tear gas and rubber bullets into them. Not a moment spared to continue the trauma. Now imagine if it was reversed. If Palestinian gunmen opened fire on Israelis welcoming home prisoners, the world would completely erupt. But when Israel does it, there's complete silence. Such is life under a genocidal apartheid regime. And for 2 years, Israel's mighty military couldn't subdue Gaza, a tiny strip of land under siege for decades, cut off from food, from water, from medicine, from the entire world. And as the Al-Qassam Brigade said, the enemy failed to retrieve its captives through military pressure, despite its intelligence superiority and overwhelming power. Now it is forced to recover them through a prisoner exchange deal, just as the resistance promised from the beginning. Even more revealing, the ceasefire agreement forces Israel to lift its blockade on food and supplies into Gaza, the same blockade it spent years denying existed. We were told it was a myth that Israel allows aid in but we all know the truth. And yet, with the stroke of a pen, they admitted it. Now, Trump has flown in for the cameras to claim credit for ending the war. He stood before the Knesset, smiling beside billionaire Israel lobbyist Miriam Edelson, joking about her $60 billion fortune and her late husband, Sheldon Adelson's power. He even bragged that he once asked her, "What do you love more, the United States or Israel?" And she refused to answer. If anyone else said that, they'd be destroyed, fired, smeared, silenced. But Trump, he just says that out loud. And he flew into Cairo to meet President Sisi and finalize this so-called peace plan. But this deal isn't peace when you are dealing with the collaborators of the genocide, the access of assistance. These are the people that rubber-stamped Israel's theft, the normalization of genocide, the annexation, the erasure of Palestine from the map. And where are the Arab leaders? The same ones who wave the Palestinian flag in speeches, but quietly helped enable 2 years of slaughter? They have disgraced their people and the entire region. They created land corridors for Israel so that Israel can circumvent the Red Sea blockade and receive their shipments in full. They have collaborated with the occupier while Gaza burned. The blood is on their hands too. And for Trump, Gaza is not a tragedy. It's a real estate opportunity. He's already eyeing beachfront developments on the rubble and the skeletons of the world's largest open-air prison. Instead of sending diplomats, he sends developers, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, to oversee what's left of Gaza. They're joined by Israeli officials expanding illegal settlements and grabbing land in Gaza and Syria alike. Beneath the ashes lie billions in offshore gas reserves, and they all want a piece of that cake. For them, Gaza is just a gold mine. But for us Palestinians, it's our home that has now turned into ashes. But let's be clear, this genocide didn't just expose Israel's crimes, it exposed the entire system that protects them. Our so-called democracies proved how easily they can become fascist when their empire is threatened. They censored journalists, deplatformed activists, criminalized protest, and called it security. Look at Palestine Action in the UK. Activists who shut down weapons factories, supplying Israel with the weapons and the parts so they can drop bombs on our children. They're sitting in prison cells right now for exposing and opposing genocide. Meanwhile, the war criminals who armed Israel, funded the bombs, and justified the slaughter on TV, well, they walk free. This is the new reality. The empire will jail you for resisting genocide while rewarding those who commit it. This is why accountability matters. Because if we let this pass, if we allow this genocide to fade into the rearview mirror, we are saying, do it again. For 2 years, we witnessed genocide live streamed on our phones. And most of our politicians and pundits cheered it on. They called the murder of children self-defense. They called starvation counterterrorism. They called resistance terror. Gaza has unmasked the empire, completely lifting the veil. There are no moral limits it won't cross. No crimes too horrific for it to justify. No amount of blood too much for it to wash its hands on. But Gaza also unmasks something else. Us. The people who refuse to stay silent. Those who march, who speak out, who disrupt, who organize, who boycott. Those who say, not in our name, not with our taxes, and not ever again. This genocide must be remembered, not as an isolated atrocity, but as a warning. And accountability must not just come for the bombers, but for the banks, the media, and the politicians who made it possible. Because until there is justice, until there's accountability, there will be no peace. I'm Mnar Adley, and this is Behind the Headlines. All right, well, I'm excited to bring on our first guest today, which is Aaron Mate. He is an award-winning investigative journalist at The Gray Zone and on Substack, and he's also the co-host of Useful Idiots podcast with Katie Halper. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us today.
Mnar, great to be with you.
Well, I want to first start by asking you about the ceasefire deal. We've seen Israel release almost 2,000 Palestinians in exchange for 20 Israelis. What's your reaction to the news of the ceasefire? And do you think that this represents a win for Israel or Hamas?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts. Look, by definition, any end to the genocide, if this is indeed what it is, and with Israel, you never know, because they have a long record of violating every deal that they enter into, whether it's in Gaza or Lebanon or the West Bank. But if this is indeed an end to the genocide, then that's by definition a welcome development, because what's been happening to the people of Gaza for the last 2 years is just unimaginable. I can't even put it into words. So if that phase of their torment is over, then that's good. But aside from that, look, none of the underlying issues are addressed by this deal. It's simply an exchange of hostages, at 20, as you said, Israelis, and hundreds, thousands of Palestinians. But of course, there are thousands more Palestinian hostages still in Israeli prisons. And meanwhile, the fundamental issue of denying Palestinians their basic rights, that remains unchanged. And Trump has made no suggestion that he's interested in dealing with that, because it's been bipartisan U.S. policy for decades now to back Israel in its military occupation of the Palestinian people, theft of their land, theft of their resources, and continued ethnic cleansing, which began in 1948. So the deal does nothing to address that. If you read the text of Trump's so-called peace plan, there's one line in there about how we recognize a Palestinian state and self-determination as the aspiration of the Palestinian people, which is just such a completely useless line. That's like saying to a starving person who's asking you for food, I recognize that you're hungry, but I'm not going to offer you anything. So that's essentially what the Trump so-called peace plan is when it comes to Palestinians' basic rights, is recognizing their aspiration for their basic rights, but continuing to deny them those basic rights. As to who this is a victory for, well, look, the fact that Hamas wasn't completely destroyed and remained resilient after 2 years of genocide, you can call that a victory for Hamas and a defeat for Israel. But look at the cost. I mean, Gaza is completely destroyed. And so given that that was Israel's overarching objective, which is to, destroy Gaza, make it unlivable, and create the conditions for expelling as many people as possible, even though it hasn't achieved in 2 years the full-blown ethnic cleansing that it wanted, I think it's a victory for Israel. What have we really done to advance the ball for Palestinian freedom? More people around the world are aware of the evils of Zionism, and more people are disgusted by Israel. So that certainly is a loss for Israel. But in terms of Israel's objectives are to just completely erase the Palestinian nation. And I think by destroying Gaza and subjecting its people to a life of continued suffering and misery and hopelessness, I think in that respect, Israel has won.
And obviously, Palestinians have dealt a major blow in this genocide in terms of just casualties and starvation and famine and the siege that Israel has enforced on the Gaza Strip that has just created so much human suffering. And now it's almost like these leaders, including President Trump and Netanyahu, want us to just kind of turn a blind eye to their crimes against humanity, turn a blind eye against this genocide and everything that we just saw, the trauma that we just witnessed, as if it never happened, and just clap our hands and move forward. How does that make you feel?
Well, it's deeply upsetting, as Israel's existence always has been. I mean, you go back to 1967 after Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza. And someone like Moshe Dayan, who was a top Israeli general, who was considered to be sympathetic in the Israeli spectrum to the plight of the Palestinians, he said basically our policy for the West Bank will be you talking about the Palestinians, you will live like dogs. And whoever doesn't like it can leave. That's at the liberal end of the Israeli spectrum. So that's been the policy forever. And that policy endures today. Just there's not a basic recognition that the Palestinians have rights. What's changed now, unfortunately, is you have the regional deterrence to Israel a lot weaker. Uh, a lot of that comes from the dirty war in Syria, which MintPress News was one of the few outlets to cover accurately. The goal of the dirty war in Syria was to destroy an Arab country that was not in the block of states that were sort of subservient to the U.S. And to Israel. And that was a part of the axis that resists Israeli aggression. Not that Syria in recent years has been doing anything to deter Israel actively, but in previous years, like in the 2006 Lebanon war, when Israel attacked Lebanon, Syria was a critical land bridge by which Hezbollah received arms from Iran. And after then, especially the Bush administration ramped up its efforts for regime change in Syria, which culminated in the dirty war that began under Barack Obama in 2011. So that had the impact not only of destroying Syria, but also bleeding the real deterrence to Israeli aggression in the region, Iran and Hezbollah, which I think was also a main goal of the dirty war. Even if they couldn't achieve regime change in Syria, they could destroy it, steal its resources via the U.S. military occupation, put it under brutal sanctions, and also draw in Iran and Hezbollah and bleed them, which is exactly what happened. And then after October 7th, Israel took advantage of all that to take its war of aggression to both Lebanon and Iran. So you have the main deterrence to Israel weakened as a result of the legacy of the dirty war and also Israel's brutality and aggression since October 7th. And then you have, meanwhile, the Gulf monarchies, Turkey, who all participated in the dirty war in Syria, who, speak words in support of Palestinian rights, but what have they actually done? And in fact, one of the things they've done is cooperate with the Israeli military. There was just a report in the Washington Post saying that throughout the genocide, while states like Qatar and Saudi Arabia were denouncing Israel, they were meeting with the Israeli military privately to coordinate against Iran. So you have Israeli-U.S. hegemony increasing in these last 2 years of genocide. You also have the Gulf monarchies being more collaborative with Israel and the U.S. And in the process, even dropping their previous stances that at least defended Palestinians' absolute minimum rights. Like for a long time, there's been a global consensus, which even at times Hamas has accepted. And I know it's not very popular for people who understand the realities of Israel and the evils of Zionism. But there has been a consensus that Palestinians should at least have a state in 22% of their stolen homeland. The PLO accepted that. Hamas leaders accepted that. Iran accepted that. And the entire Arab League accepted that. In 2002, they made a peace offer to Israel for full normalization if it gave the Palestinians a state in just 22% of their stolen homeland, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. Now, if you care about equality and freedom, it's still an unjust solution because it perpetuates this Jewish supremacist state that stole Palestinians' land. But it's also the global consensus and a recognition of the best, at least currently, the best possibly realistic scenario. So that's why it was offered to Israel. And now the Arab states don't even offer that. They don't even offer that massive compromise that Palestinians previously accepted, which speaks to how Israeli-U.S. power has been emboldened in recent years and by this genocide.
I mean, we saw all of these so-called Axis of Assistance Nations meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh yesterday with Donald Trump. And, we called it what it is. This was a meeting of the collaborators of the genocide, not a meeting for peace. And of course, now we have leading the negotiations for the U.S. They were not diplomats, but real estate developers, including Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who last year noted that waterfront property could be very valuable in Gaza. So you recently described Kushner as a perpetual winner of the world's most genocidal bar mitzvah speech. What's your take on the Trump administration in all of this and their plans to turn Gaza into a real estate front property?
Well, the line about, Jared Kushner, giving a perpetual genocidal bar mitzvah speeches. This is like, he sounds like he's giving a bar mitzvah speech. Like, it reminds me of the bar mitzvah speeches I used to hear when I had to go to bar mitzvahs growing up. So that's what I hear in Jared Kushner. And yeah, Jared Kushner, and let's call them what they are. They aren't just real estate developers. It's easier for me to say this because I'm Jewish. They're Jewish real estate developers, and they're avowed Zionists, both Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. Steve Witkoff's supposed to be Trump's top Middle East peace envoy. A few months ago, he spoke at a fundraiser for a anti-Palestinian pro-Israel group, and in the audience was a former chief of Mossad. Okay, so Steve Witkoff's speaking, and it's at a certain point he stops his prepared remarks. He goes, "Oh my God, I have to stop for a second. My Jewish mother would be so proud of me. The former chief of Mossad just clapped for me." So he was like all emotional that a former Israeli spy chief just clapped for him. So these are the people who are so-called, who are leading Trump's so-called peace efforts, like people who get verklempt at Israeli spy chiefs clapping for them, and people who are avowed Zionists who want to turn Gaza into beachfront property for themselves and their Zionist friends. So it's a farce. And it's just such an indictment of the Biden administration that even these people, that even these avowed Zionists who don't care about Palestinians whatsoever, that even for them, this genocide went on for too long, and they finally told Netanyahu to knock it off. Biden could have had this exact same deal from the start. You know, right after October 7th, Hamas offered Israel to free all the civilian captives that it took if Israel didn't attack Gaza. Israel didn't care because it seized the opportunity to fulfill its long-term objective of destroying Gaza and pushing as many people out into exile, on top of the original exile of the Nakba, where, you know, which is where most Palestinians in Gaza come from, because most Palestinians in Gaza are either refugees or the descendants of refugees. And some of the areas that were attacked in the October 7th operation were former Palestinian villages that were stolen from the people who now live in Gaza and their families. So that's who we have leading diplomacy for Trump, avowed Zionists who want to just turn Gaza into a place where they can make more money.
And you mentioned that the Biden administration could have struck this deal at any moment when he was president. And we just had Kamala Harris tweet out so proudly, like she was bragging, that, you know, Trump shouldn't really get all the credit for making this so-called peace plan. It was really her and Biden that brought most of the peace to Gaza. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, to me, the most interesting aspect of the Democrats, like the Biden camp, is that their cowardice on the issue of Israel-Palestine and their just refusal to take on the Israel lobby and to adopt like any minimal recognition of Palestinian rights, like that subservience to Israel, it supersedes even their desire for power, like to be in office. Because if Kamala, everyone knows this, if Kamala had just even slightly distanced herself from Biden on the issue of the Gaza genocide, she would have radically improved her chances of winning, radically. And it was such an easy political thing to do. I mean, forget morals for a second, because we can't expect politicians to have that. But just thinking like strategically from like the idea of like a cold-blooded Washington Beltway pragmatist, you have polls showing that the Democratic base is like revolted by Biden's policy on Gaza. And all they want is for some like minimal break from Kamala Harris, even if it wasn't even sincere, just saying it, right? But she wouldn't do it. And why? Because I guess like the hatred of Palestinians, their dehumanization, and like the veneration of Israel as our ally and blah, blah, blah. It's so embedded in U.S. establishment culture that even someone trying to win the presidency was not willing to break from Israel and break from Biden's slavish support for Israel. So it just speaks to the absolute anti-Palestinian fanaticism we have embedded into our political culture, where people would rather serve Israel than even win an election. It's really unbelievable. And it speaks to just years and years of propaganda and the power that the Israel lobby has, not just in Washington, but in all aspects of society. Because say you're Kamala Harris and like you're thinking about your post politics career, you know, because these people get book deals and speaking tours. You know, Kamala Harris probably knows subconsciously that if she speaks out for Palestine in some like just perfunctory way, like the most like minimal, like letting a Palestinian speaker who wants to endorse her to speak at the DNC convention, she might be thinking about, well, if I do that, I might not get a lucrative speaking gig or a book deal. These things have an impact on these people who aren't just thinking about politics or thinking about their position of power within the U.S. establishment. And so they'd rather sell out their own political chances than acknowledge Palestinian suffering and do something a little differently than what Biden did. And instead, we got people like AOC going up and saying that Kamala Harris is working tirelessly for a ceasefire, even though it wasn't true. And she could have lied and said Kamala Harris will work tirelessly for a ceasefire, which again would be a lie, but at least it wouldn't be demonstrably false because that would be aspirational sometime in the future. But they insulted all of us and they made it impossible to vote for them. And I say this, I mean, listen, I'm in the minority, I think, in my camp when it comes to like media circles. I actually believe in lesser evil voting. I'd rather have a president that doesn't cut Medicaid for low income people and give even bigger tax breaks to the ultra wealthy. But Democrats made it absolutely impossible to adopt the lesser evil strategy because they actually showed on the issue of the Gaza genocide that they were the bigger evil, given that they let the genocide go on for as long as they did. They refused to stop it, and they ceded that lane to Trump, who finally ended it.
They basically set it all up for Trump to continue the genocide.
Yes,
no doubt.
did.
So in the last 24 hours, dozens of world leaders have met in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, to plan the future for Palestine as if it's their role to decide our future as Palestinians. Is anything good going to come out of this US-led summit? What do you think?
I don't see anything good coming out of this except for an end to the genocide, which again is something to welcome, but we can't fool ourselves into thinking that there's any steps towards justice, minimal Palestinian rights. There's just none of that. The Gulf states have long seen Palestinians as kind of a nuisance, and they don't offer them anything. They're just kind of a distraction. And they're going along with this Trump process of the so-called Abraham Accords, which is just a way for Israel to normalize with its neighbors while offering the Palestinians absolutely nothing. And all they're willing to say is that there should be a pathway to a Palestinian state, which is just such a meaningless term. I mean, either there's a Palestinian state or there isn't. A pathway, that kind of language is just an excuse to put Palestinians on a road to nowhere. That's what a pathway means. It's somewhere far off in the future. We just have to get there. No, if you want to give Palestinians a state, then the answer is very obvious. Uproot all of the illegal settlers in the occupied West Bank, all of them. They have no right to be there. And give Palestinians the absolute minimum. And of course, they deserve their entire homeland back. But the problem there is Israel's nuclear weapons, and I just don't see the immediate path to achieving that. So at the very minimum, give Palestinians what their leaders have already accepted, a state in 22% of their stolen homeland. But of course, that's not even in the conversation. And as I said earlier, the Arab League has stopped talking about that. And you can see just how determined all these leaders are to crush Palestinian self-determination by the refusal to free Marwan Barghouti, who everybody knows is the most popular political leader in Palestine. If there were elections, if Israel allowed elections, he would win. He's not even from Hamas. He can't even use the Hamas canard. He has advocated in the past nonviolence. He ticks all the boxes that like Western liberals claim to support when it comes to Palestine. Not that he should have to tick all those boxes, but I'm saying is from the point of view of their fallacious arguments, they have none to make because he's a popular leader with legitimacy, and he's not even from Hamas, which, everyone insists can't rule Gaza anymore. And in fact, Hamas says we don't even want to rule Gaza anymore, so that's not even an issue. So Israel won't free him. The Palestinian Authority, it's my sense they've kind of abandoned him because they see him as a threat to themselves as well, because who are they? They're a corrupt collaborationist authority. And Hamas, to their credit, tried to get him freed. He was one of the people at the top of their list. I think that was the major goal of October 7th, freeing a Palestinian political leader who could unite the Palestinian people, unite the different factions, and have popular legitimacy, which is, contrary to all the propaganda that Hamas has wanted to go in and kill Israeli civilians. No, they were trying to do the only thing that they felt they had left, which is to create leverage for themselves after having none, after trying nonviolent protest, after trying to accept a Palestinian state in just 22% of their historic homeland, after being put under siege when they won elections. So this was their next last gasp is to try to free a Palestinian political leader like Marwan Barghouti, who could actually unite the Palestinian people and be credible. So you can see in the refusal to release Marwan Barghouti by Israel that there's just this continued determination to crush the Palestinian struggle for freedom. And unfortunately, you have more states in the region now that are acquiescing to that. And so it's very ominous.
Absolutely. And what's even more ominous is how this genocide has completely transformed, or maybe even lifted the veil on just this Israeli takeover of our corporate media and political system. I mean, on the home front, we have pro-Israel multi-billionaires like the Ellisons buying CBS and possibly TikTok. That's coming up here very soon. And installing Barry Weiss as editor-in-chief of CBS. The Financial Times has reported that it was explicitly her pro-Israel views that got her the job. So what have you made of this hire, and what does this say about the state of modern journalism today?
I'm a fan of comedy. And so my problem is I love comedy so much that in thinking about Barry Weiss being installed at the head of CBS News, I like the humor of it just takes over because to me, it's hilarious. This like unqualified opinion columnist who's made a career out of like being an activist for Israel with no journalism experience whatsoever, with founding an outlet that's like just such a transparent joke. One of their biggest stories was trying to deny the famine in Gaza by making the argument that because some of the famine-stricken kids had pre-existing conditions and it's not really a famine. And of course, the fact that suffering, medically compromised people experience starvation is of course that's going to happen when you have a famine. Is like the most vulnerable people are going to suffer first. I mean, that's just like So anyway, her being installed to CBS News, and like imagine being a CBS News employee who like tries to take journalism seriously, and all of a sudden your new boss is someone with no journalism experience who's there because she's a pro-Israel activist, and it's just like, hey, I'm your boss now. It's like it's a bad comedy. So it's funny, and it does lift the mask off of Zionist control of our media, along with the fact that TikTok has been taken over by the same forces that installed Barry Weiss at CBS News. Because as U.S. politicians from Mitt Romney to Anthony Blinken openly admitted, the kids were seeing too much footage of dead babies in Gaza, and they were mad about it. So therefore we have to shut TikTok down. So the mask is off. It's funny, but it's also terrifying. It speaks to this continued erosion of our freedom, of our a press that's actually doing its job, and the upside is that nobody trusts these institutions anymore. And do you think Barry Weiss is going to help the fortunes of CBS News? I feel bad for its employees, but given that CBS News is a part of a propaganda system that overall indoctrinates people on core issues of foreign policy, especially of U.S. hegemony, then maybe Barry Weiss by heading CBS News is doing us all a favor by just exposing what a complete scam our so-called free press is.
Well, a recent poll showed that what trust in American media is at like the lowest point it's ever been in like recent history. I think the number was like 25% or something like that. And makes me wonder, who are these 25% individuals? I mean, I would think it's like this remaining Christian Zionist supporters of Israel. And so she will definitely keep them entertained. So for my final question for you, Aaron, in recent years, we've seen Twitter being purchased by the stridently pro-Israel Republican Elon Musk. We've seen Jeff Bezos tell his staff at the Washington Post that critiquing capitalism and the US-led order is explicitly barred. And we're seeing now the forced sale of TikTok to Larry Ellison, who is the Israeli military's largest international funder. Is there any hope in this media landscape as an independent journalist yourself who covers the forever war machine? And where can people turn to get the truth?
Well, listen, one result of the recent Trump period is a complete collapse in trust in corporate media. And, part of that is for unfortunate reasons, like the sort of like the Trump mythology and the cultish aspects of MAGA just refusing to have any criticism of dear leader, right? That's one uh, reason for the decline of trust in corporate media, which is not a thing to welcome. But another reason is totally legitimate, which is that the media did act in a deceptive way and on so many issues related to Trump. I mean, the most, I think, obvious example, and the one I spent a lot of time on, is Russiagate, one of the dumbest conspiracy theories of all time. The fact that the idea that Trump is a Russian agent and he's compromised by the Kremlin and Russian oligarchs, and Russia waged this massive interference campaign to brainwash Americans. It was a complete scam on so many different levels. And by the way, since we're talking about the Gaza genocide, you saw the clip, I'm sure, of Trump going to the Israeli parliament and like basically again admitting that he did the bidding of Israel first oligarchs, Miriam and Sheldon Adelson. He reminded everybody that he moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem for them, that he does their bidding. And compare that to all the time and energy, to how much time was wasted going down this rabbit hole of like the fictional Russian oligarchs controlling Trump and the fictional Kremlin minders controlling Trump. Do any of these people who fear-mongered about so-called Russian interference have anything to say about Trump's open admission of doing the bidding of Israel oligarchs under Israeli influence? No, because Russiagate was just a scam. And so, for good reason, people don't trust the media because everyone in the media, including, I'm sorry to say, some of our independent media colleagues went along with it. So in that respect, there are aspects of the decline of trust in corporate media that are positive, but there's also a cultish MAGA element here where there's just no criticism tolerated of the leader. And that's a problem. And another problem is the spaces we're in, Mnar. I mean, I think MintPress is a rare exception that doesn't get duped by the same forces that fool us on so many issues. Like, so for example, you take an issue like the Gaza genocide. That's not controversial with an independent media. No one supports Israel. Initially, there were some people who would parrot some Israeli propaganda, like the rape hoax. They got duped by that. But for the most part, I think independent media coverage is really good. You look at a show like Democracy Now!, where I used to work, they do great coverage of Gaza. They interview great people. Although I have to say they also boycott certain great guests like Norman Finkelstein, who hasn't been on throughout the entire Gaza genocide, but that's another story. But on other issues like the Ukraine proxy war, like Syria, like Russiagate, the stories that require more critical thinking and more intellectual self-defense from our very sophisticated propaganda system, there, some of our colleagues have done a terrible job, and they've been duped by the same propaganda that they debunk on other issues. So that's something to address. And for people working in independent media, there's no shortage of opportunities to be on the right side, to be on the side of truth. But it's hard because things are increasingly fragmented. People's attention is pulled in so many different ways. It's hard to, get people to read something these days because there's just so many choices on offer. But as always, so long as we have some semblance of freedom, which we do have here, there are opportunities for people telling the truth.
Absolutely. And we thank you and commend you for challenging the status quo with your reporting at the Gray Zone and Substack and your show with Katie Halper. And hopefully we'll have you on again, Aaron Mate. Thank you so much.
Mnar, thank you for having me on. Thank you for all you do at MintPress. And I urge anyone with the means to support your outlet, which I think does really important journalism that very few other people, including in the independent media space, are doing. So it's an honor to join you. And thank you.
Oh, thank you, Aaron. Really appreciate that.